Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We understand that you all have very busy schedules, and we are grateful that you chose to spend the next hour with us. My name is Joanne Culverhouse, and I'm the Superintendent of La Habra City School District. This webinar this evening is co-sponsored by the UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information Studies, which I am proud to say I'm a graduate of cohort 3. Today, we are also sponsored by the Women's School Leadership Academy. I've had the privilege of being part of this remarkable group of women. WSLA, it's a leadership development initiative for female school leaders with the courage to lead. And it offers women the opportunity to increase their impact of schooling to support and be supported by other women, which is phenomenal. It's a wonderful program. The purpose of the webinar this evening is to engage women educators in a conversation about leading and about being courageous during a crisis in leadership. We will discuss the following questions. What does courageous leadership look like at the start of the pandemic and its continuing phases? And what courageous leadership look like in meeting the challenges of Black Lives Matter in our schools? So now let's meet our panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Cristina De Jesus. Cristina is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Green Dot Public Schools California, which is a charter management organization serving over 11,000 students in 19 public charter schools across LA. She has been with Green Dot for 18 years, and prior to her current position, she served as a 6th grade English teacher in the Santa Monica, Malibu, and also as a high school principal. She received her 3 degrees at UCLA, including her doctorate in educational leadership. Dr. Lolly Lucas is the assistant head of the Buckley School, and she has many years of leadership experience in independent schools, as well as teaching courses in leadership and in civil rights. Lolly was a history teacher at the upper school, and we're very happy to have her. Dr. Erin Richison is the Senior Director of District and School Improvement at the San Diego County Office of Education. Erin leads a team of former school principals who support current and future administrators throughout the county. Prior to her current position, Dr. Richison was a high school principal and English learner director. So welcome, Erin. I had a quick opportunity to introduce myself. I received my undergraduate at Nevada, Reno, and my doctorate at UCLA. I began my career as a teacher and served as an elementary, a middle, and a high school principal before becoming a superintendent. So, ladies, let's get started. I would like to begin with a general question for our panelists. As you are aware, we are experiencing a health crisis, an economic crisis, and a major civil unrest in our country, in our counties, and within our cities. So as a leader, kind of talk to us about it and provide some examples that would indicate how you have been a courageous leader during this time of crisis. And Lolly, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here. And I want to, of course, thank my panelists and of course, Dr. J, who's leading this. It's not easy to do this moderation and she's going to kill it all night long. And of course, Dr. Rose, who is a mentor of mine. I'm here to tell you that I think about things when crisis hit. I think about my family. I think about my faculty. I think about my staff. I think about my students. I think about how I can complete all of that in a way that helps us all grow and be together. So when a crisis happens, I go deep into what it is that I need to do. I'm a mother of 3 boys, and I want to make sure that I raise them in a way that they can respond and be resilient. And that's how I look at what we need to do with our students. As a woman leader, sometimes I think that goes overlooked because people don't think that should be our first look. It should be your first look. That's how I lead, with heart, soul, commitment, and responsibility to make sure that everybody's voices can be heard and that we will pull through all of these challenges together with an open voice and an open mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Lolly. And I think that is why we have so many participants here this evening, all being women, because women leadership is different. It does look different. So thank you, Lolly, very much. Erin, let's go to you now.
Sure. I think really similar to Lolly is waking up every morning and being human. And human as a mother, human as a leader, human as a daughter. And, you know, a few years ago, I read the book by Margaret Wheatley, Who Do You Choose to Be? And that has, since March school closures, I have just asked that question to myself of who do I choose to be in the time of COVID? And leading that way in a time when all of our interactions, our human interactions, are virtual. And so I know that what I see on the screen is the tip of the iceberg for the leaders that I'm meeting with those working in schools and districts and doing really heavy lifts. I know there's a whole underneath that I'm not seeing on Zoom. And I have one too. And so, you know, having kids and doing virtual school and all of those things, being the lunch lady, being the noon duty, being the PE teacher, all of those things that I just really think that, I don't know if it's courageous, but just every day waking up and being human.
Erin, how old are your kids at home learning?
I have an almost 8-year-old and I have a 10-year-old.
Well, so you are in the thick of it. Lolly, how about you? How old are your children?
So I have a 14-year-old, a 13-year-old, and an 8-year-old. And I'm here to tell everyone I'm really scared of teenagers. I'm trying, but I'm really scared of them. They're making the most of me every day. So that is my crisis.
I love it. Christina, what about you in this time during crisis?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with all of you here this evening. As you hit on, Joanne, the pandemic has really laid bare the economic opportunity and resource divides that exist across this country and within the public education system. So courage in this moment has been critical and has definitely put my personal mission into greater focus. I will say, similar to probably many of you, in March, I had many families and many staff members looking at me for answers to questions that I did not have. And so in that moment, you have to choose courage and watching the resilience of my students and the families we serve and our staff members. Really, there was nothing more to do than to be a courageous leader. It has meant accepting I may not have all the answers, forgiving myself for the small mistakes and oversights I've made along the way. I've tried to face challenges with a mix of vulnerability and compassion and strength and the good old fake it till you make it part of leadership. But it's also meant, you know, ensuring that, you know, I think you hit on it, Erin, I don't have children of my own, but I know that, you know, we've been able to witness each other's humanities through our computer screens over the last 7 months and see ourselves as people as well as educators. And so leaning into that humanity has really been a silver lining in all of this, but it's also been critical in terms of making decisions on behalf of students and staff. And I'll just say, ultimately, courage has meant reminding myself I am uniquely qualified to lead in this moment with almost 26 years as an educator. I've been a classroom teacher, a principal, led through many change management initiatives, but I've had to remind myself over and over again through the doubtful and dark times in the last 7 months that I can handle this moment.
Yeah, and I think that those points are all well taken because this is so unprecedented and people look to us as leaders. As a school superintendent, it's the same situation. You have to really dig down deep, and as a courageous leader, you can't be afraid to lead. And you can't be afraid to make mistakes. You know, Christine, I heard you talking about, you know, vulnerability. That's the Brene Brown of the leader that talks to us about vulnerability. And as a school superintendent, was extremely important that I gathered a team together. You know, we have a great team, but you can't do this alone. Any listener out there that is trying to find the answers by themselves, it's like, go back there and get your people, get your board of directors, get the people that will see you vulnerable, pull together and start asking those questions as a group. so that you can solve the problems as a group, because the courageousness is coming from not just within us, but within the people that we surround ourselves with. So thank you for sharing your insight. So a couple questions right now. Christine, let's go to you on this first question. This is kind of a two-part question, and I'm going to jump in here with you. Way back in March, which seemed like it was multiple years ago, which was only several months ago, March 13th, we all know the date and when we had to close our schools, but how did you respond to the issue connected to COVID-19 in your schools, and what decisions did you have to make at that time?
Yeah, it does. It's crazy to think that was only 7 months ago. It feels
Right?
like years ago. But I can remember it very clearly. You know, once the decision to close or not to close schools was already a foregone conclusion, we immediately went to work. We have two unions, a teachers and counselors union and a classified staff union. So I immediately went to work, partnering with them on an initial side letter to make sure we could pay people. We knew what the terms of employment were. During closure, we moved up our spring break to give us a little bit more of a cushion. In all honesty, at the time, I think many of us, I certainly thought we'd be out of school for maybe a few weeks. So I thought, you know, let's move up spring break. That'll give us a cushion. And little did we know. We sent all students home with curricular resources and posted an online schedule for families, along with some other resources that they could access even from just a smartphone, just to get us through that initial couple of weeks. And then within a week, I was renegotiating another side letter for what it would mean to go to distance learning. And we wanted to make sure that teachers were supported. They'd never done this before. And so we incorporated a week of professional development. And then quickly went to work on getting the resources students needed. So we started a fundraising campaign, leverage our reserves. For us, it meant all students needed to be able to connect to distance learning. So we bought enough Chromebooks and enough internet hotspots for all 11,000 plus students in our network, and then put together a schedule to hand those out. I will say the other thing that was important to us, and I think a few people touched on this, but really creating a sense of unity and clarity of vision was important in this moment. So we developed a one organization strategy. We weren't going to have every one of the 19 schools come up with their own strategy. So we had the same bell schedule across all schools. This made it easier for us to provide content support to teachers in schools, but also provided clarity for parents. So if you have one student, two students, 5 students in our system, you knew exactly where they were supposed to be at every moment of the day and where they could get support. And all of this provided a sense of unity and stability. And then we developed a social media strategy and a communication plan through websites and emails to make sure that we were in constant contact with families. And the last thing I'll say is that we've had 4 key priorities that have actually carried us through today that also provided clarity of mission and focus. Those were equity and access, connection and well-being, transparency and communication, and sustainability. And that was both financial sustainability, because so much was unknown about budgets at that time, as well as just sustaining ourselves in the work. So I could go on and on and on, but that gives you a sense for how we tackled it. And I'm proud to say today we're live attendance, over 90% live attendance across 11,300 students, and 96% of students accessing assignments online. So it's been a lift, but I'm really proud of what we've been able to accomplish in just a really short amount of time.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting. I wish we had a couple hours to hear the stories of all of our listeners, because I think we have all had those, we all have those stories and how we handled it. We in Habra, when everything was starting, we had a 3-phase. We had a 3-tier. The first tier was, how are we going to disinfect? And then the second tier was closing down major, open houses. And then the third tier was shutting down schools. And so we were good to go. We were set. We had our teams. We started disinfecting on a Monday, and then we shifted into tier 3 on a Thursday, and we shut schools down on a Friday. So it happened so quickly. And then, as you said, Christina, then we were all anticipating that we were going to come back in a few weeks. And then it became pretty evident that we were not going to come back. And so within our district, I really saw, we are a very low socioeconomic district. We are 77% unduplicated. And the divide in the digital divide and the major gap between low socioeconomic districts and high socioeconomic districts became glaringly apparent. And when you're in charge of that, you know that you're a 77% unduplicated district. But we immediately saw that we have now sent students home and they did not have devices. So we immediately mobilized our tech department. We passed out over 4,000 devices. We worked very quickly on our hotspots. Right now, we have 500 hotspots in our community for over 5,000 students. We have worked with our city. We've worked with donors to help support the hotspots. And I am proud to say that, like you, we have all of our students connected and all of our students jumped into learning. We had a summer academy during the summer. But the thing that overarches for our district was the relationships, the connections, and in those relationships and connections, you have to be intentional as a leader. It's no longer you're on Zooms, you have to be intentional, and every decision that you made becomes magnified. So what I do on a regular basis is I have a 45-minute commute and I reflect on the people that I feel like I haven't talked to for a while, and I'll call that person. And so I think our intentional relationships have to be very, very important. So Christina, as a follow-up, it's now October, 7 years later. No, just kidding, 7 months later. What have been your professional and your personal challenges as you're accomplishing your leadership goals? And more importantly, like, what have you learned? You kind of touched on it a little bit, and Erin and Lolly, you kind of touched on this a little bit also, but inwardly, what have you learned about yourself and others in moving forward, Christina?
Yeah, Joanne, I will, I'm going to say, just to touch on something you said a moment ago, before I jump into that, we're at 95% free and reduced lunch population, 100% students of color. And I didn't even mention food insecurity, home insecurity. We've served over a million meals. The number one question we got when schools closed in the spring was not necessarily about resources, but am I going to be evicted if I can't pay my rent?
Right.
I think it's important just to understand like how hard some of our some folks in our communities are really struggling in this moment. So
Christine, just to jump in on that also, I think our listeners, the other thing that we have to realize is that kids, schools are the safe haven. Now we can't see their bruises, we can't hear about the domestic violence in the homes. We can't hear about the abuse. And so where do those children go? It's our responsibility to provide that for them. So go ahead, Christina.
That's right. So I would think, the biggest challenge remains making critical decisions in the absence of real clarity. Guidance is changing. LA still has not given the green light to schools to open. And so, really following through with making sure every decision puts safety of students and staff at front and center, making sure that I've been really transparent and collaborative. I'm now in the habit of sending out a weekly update with data points along our 4 priorities just to keep everybody aligned, controlling what we can control. So our facilities are ready for hybrid whenever we're given the green light. It could be 8 months from now, it could be, 8 weeks from now, but we're ready because we could control that. That was something I could do and didn't need anybody's permission. And then continuing just to be comfortable with uncertainty is something I'm trying to do and trying to get my organization to do. But the reality is, managing people's anxiety and exhaustion in the system right now is really hard. I've said all along, whether you live alone, you have small children, everybody's a little bit not okay right now. And I think we have to acknowledge that. And the stresses and anxiety of the world around us in the last 7 months have everyone feeling really anxious and unstable. And the other thing that I thought about the other day was, the non-contingent interactions. Unless you're going to Zoom bomb somebody's meeting, you're not having non-contingent interactions in the hallway or at someone's cubicle. Those are gone. So when do you have that non-contingent time with people is something that, we're trying to figure out as an organization. My biggest struggles right now are really solving for the students that are furthest away from opportunity and the hardest to reach. Chronic absenteeism, students not completing assignments, how do we best support them? I'm really trying to figure out how to better support parents. Parents are really struggling. There's been a lot of pressure put on parents in our system to support their students. And it's unfair. No matter how structured we have our schedule, no matter how much support, we have to admit there's still a lot of pressure on parents. I will say for me, leading during this time has felt very isolating at times, more so than normal. I think you hit on it, Joanne. Everyone is making judgments about what I decide to do, what I decide not to do. And that's really nothing different from normal, whatever normal is at this point in times, but I feel like it's magnified right now because there's so much on the line. So I've tried to lean into my networks, share resources, and reach out to folks who I know are going through the same struggles just to get through. And you have to do that. You mentioned that. You can't do it alone. And so I've tried to lean on those that I trust the most.
Good. I find that I've noticed with people that they're all walking around like this. It's like if you look around, everybody, even if they're not like this, it's like lower those shoulders, take a deep breath. I think for me, and then we're going to jump to another subject in just a second, but just to piggyback on that, Christina, it's also just not forgetting to breathe. And for us, it's, we are so busy, and I think all of our listeners right now are probably in the same category. We're running around, we're making decisions, and sometimes we forget to celebrate those decisions. It just becomes like this decision. We just brought our transitional kindergarten, our special day class, and our kindergarten students back on Monday. And we are celebrating 3 days of great success right now because we're not learning in person on Monday. And that was tough. I would recommend, if those of you that have not done your reentry plan, we're doing TK1 this week. TK this week, 1-2 the following week, 3-4, and then 5-8. We're a K-8 district. But just not to forget that sense of humor. I end every week with my cabinet. We have 7 people on our cabinet, and they know it's coming, so they prepare for it. At the end of every Friday, I pull people together. If people have left, I get them on speakerphone, and I ask them this most important question: what made you laugh this week? And it allows us every Friday to just laugh again. What made you laugh? The silliest things that make people laugh. And we all come together, we laugh with each other, we laugh at each other. But that question has taken this down for our staff and our principals, especially. A lot of weight on our principals right now of understanding that. Christina, thank you. When I had you on the spot the whole time, and now I'm going to shift over on a different topic. We're going to go to the next topic. And Lolly and Erin, this is a different topic, but within this same crisis, because students' lives are impacted by this. And let's discuss Black Lives Matter movement in the school and the district. And so Lolly, the question, let me start with Erin. So Erin, let me start with you on this one. And what are the challenges and what changes have you made in moving forward? Erin, why don't you go ahead and start for us?
Okay, well, first, I'm in a really unique position because I work for San Diego County Office of Education. So my touch to students is a little bit distant. And, we serve 500,000 students and 42 districts, and that's not including our charters. And so when I saw this question, one, I felt like I don't know how I'm impacting our students. But the other thing is I had this great remorse. Because back in 2016, when Colin Kaepernick was taking the knee, and even my sports radio station was all of a sudden political, and I was really moved to pick up the phone and call the high school principals that I knew and ask the question, how are we preparing our coaches to have these conversations with our youth? We know that we mimic what's on television. We see that October all the time where our high school students are wearing pink for Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And knowing that, do our students know the implications of it? And also to coach some of our coaches through, like, it's okay to have voice. And I say that I entered into it with remorse because I never picked up the phone.
Mhm.
I never said out loud, Black Lives Matter. I believed it. I said it in my head and I said it in my heart, but it didn't actualize. And so this time, when a community really close to us, a community I served for 10 years, had civil unrest, had protesters, had bank buildings burned, I looked to see how the community was responding to our youth. How were districts sending out messages to their youth about how they were supported? And I kind of saw a void. And I realized that I needed to find my voice. I needed to really get the courage to say out loud, Black Lives Matter. I needed to build my my equity muscle to have these hard conversations. And so I started with my team. I started with my team and opened up space and said, I don't know how to do this to a colleague. And so she came alongside me and coached me, and we had amazing conversations, tears. And then that gave me the courage that I could do that from that point on. And so since then, we've held space as the civil unrest continues, as protest continues, as the political rhetoric ramps up. We've held space to really talk so that we can lead. We have a systems framework that says we need to lead ourselves first before we can lead others. And so we're taking on conversations about white supremacist language, our behaviors that exist, microaggressions, looking at our educational historical timeline so that we can come along our leaders in San Diego and help them find their voice.
Oh, that's excellent. And Lolly, and when you said you were a Black mom raising three children and a female leader, talk to us about what are the challenges with the Black Lives Matter movement and what changes have been made in moving forward in your school and district.
I so appreciate that. And I just really want to say, Erin, I just want to give you a hug. I wished I could. When the time is over, I will, because all the work we do in this is what matters. Thank you for the question. I want to say that my entire career has been dedicated to this. I went to school where I was one of only 5 Black people in the entire school.
Wow.
So I understand from a personal experience what it's like to be in a situation where your whole identity, ethnicity, everything is different. I'm extremely fortunate that my parents were fully engaged in making sure that they wanted me to know you are a strong Black woman. And I want to make that really clear in terms of my leadership and in terms of what happens. That's how I've been able to be courageous when I have to look at decades and decades and decades and centuries of everything. And so I look to my heritage, I look to history, I look to telling stories about the people that have helped me get to where I am, to help me tell that story so that I can empower, as you mentioned, Joanne, my sons, my family, my students. And I think that's really important in this moment. I was devastated. There's no doubt about it. I'm still shaken. All of what has happened, all that happened with the COVID pandemic, George Floyd, it is difficult to grasp. So I want to make it clear that my heart breaks for all that we have to continue to struggle. And then I stop and I think about my responsibility as an educator and what that means that I can do. I fought a very long time to teach a civil rights movement class. My civil rights movement class is based upon that as a movement. I also talk about the feminist movement. I talk about the gay movement. I talk about the environment movement, all to use as an example to say, what is it that we are going to be able to do to make wrongs right? So in my class, the students have to turn to the second quarter to do something that is of personal importance to them. What can you do in your community? What can you lend to serve? And in my position, that's what I want. I'm trying to every day raise citizens who care about themselves and about the people around them, who have an understanding of what that means. I am so fortunate in my current situation where the education about language around DEIJ is totally different than what I just explained in my experience. That was nothing that I had when I was there. So I have to look to how inspiring so many people have done to create these opportunities so that we can have these conversations and move it forward. It's critical. And I know there are going to be questions about this, but it's throughout our curriculum. How are we addressing this question? How are we talking to each other? How are we thinking about, people will say civil discourse or creating a dialogue of, equity. How are we doing this in each and every way? And so for me, when all this happened, I had to turn to quick steps. My school had a great foundation about this work. I'm so grateful for that. I'm proud of that. And then we had to move quick. And so we have initiated a tremendous amount of work on anti-racism, both in terms of the top. And I want to say that too, as a woman leader, remember, when you're in charge, stay in charge, but make sure your board and everyone else knows that it's important that they message that message. So I'm proud of my board. I'm proud of my administration. I'm proud of my faculty. I'm proud of my staff. We have done professional development. We worked all summer, as everyone has, to just think about remote learning and COVID. And then here we were to have to engage in conversation with some about what this work looked like.
Right.
And you just have to keep moving, keep inspiring. I tell people all the time, I know it's complicated. I know we have different issues and concerns, but let's do it together. And so that's what I do. I just make sure that I have structures in place to support my faculty, my staff, my students, my parents. Let's talk about that. There's a huge thing about parent education around this issue, as you know. And so it's all of it, but it's important. And I'm saddened and I'm struck by what has happened and sadly what will continue to happen. But if I don't keep moving based upon what I was raised to do, then I'm not doing my job.
Yeah. I was, after the George Floyd murder, it was interesting as a superintendent because all the boards, I like that you mentioned your board, Lolly, and I know Erin and Christine, you talked about the boards also, but I was so proud of our board because they did not want to sign a resolution because they felt that that was just words on paper. Mm-hmm. And now we put our plan into place about when our students, as we're moving forward, coming back, what does that look like to support the Black Lives Matter? So Lolly, just a question that you could answer. As you know, we're sitting here as a panelist. There are three of us are white women leaders. We have one Black leader. What do you say to the other leaders out there that are listening to this when you are in an environment when someone says, but all lives matter? Mm-hmm. How do we as white leaders coach the environment, the culture that we have when people are talking about all lives matter? What would you recommend for the listeners and how to kind of coach us through that?
I really appreciate that question. I also want to say that rhetoric has become part of this. And let me back up. When we talk about anti-racism, some people think if I just put that out there, you're saying I'm a racist. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that I want you to understand what the systems have been, what the history has been, what this looks like. And I think that sometimes the language of things gets in the way of us opening a conversation. And so what I encourage when you ask that question, first of all, I think people look to me because I am Black, and
Right.
I'm proud of that.
Right.
I also am proud that I have so many colleagues across all genders, races, everything that say, I want to be involved in this work. Do not think that you cannot lean in. I have never, ever had an opportunity where people have come to me and said, I want to do this work. What can I do? I'll walk with you. I'll talk with you. We can do this together. Don't think it's because of who you are or what you look like. It's what's important to you and what's important to your students' education. So my thing about that is breaking down some of the terms and the fear about it, because I'm going to embrace you, Dr. J, for whoever you are, because I know you care, and we may agree or disagree, but we want the same things in terms of educating our children. And if we don't, then we're going to have that conversation. So I want everyone to embrace this work in that same way. As we were talking about before, humanity, open heart. I will say, though, I am not trying to say that we are colorblind. We are not. So there are certain terms and things like that, as you mentioned, with Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, that we need to be careful about. We have not actually committed to this idea, I'm sorry, and I'm speaking from the I, in this community, that we are a quilt. No, every identity, who we are, is important, but what's important is owning that, sharing that in an open way so that we can dialogue. And I embrace all of that every day, all day long.
Thank you. We did implicit bias training back in January. I was just so proud of the presenter, and we did it. It was mandatory for all districts, but I had one individual come up to me afterwards and say, I'm good, Dr. Culverhouse. I don't see color in my classroom. And I went, oh my gosh, we have work to do. You have to see color in your classroom. You cannot be an educator if you do not see color in your classroom. So Lolly, thank you for that. Erin, I started off with you, but I think our listeners can see that we wanted to hit this webinar with the word courageous, because that's a question that I asked Lolly of giving us that question of what do we do to answer those questions. And I think as leaders, as women leaders, we do have to be courageous leaders. We have to, because people are looking to us to lead, and we have to step in to lead. And I think in this moment of crisis, Christina, you hit on it also. You know, we're not making decisions just for education at this time of our careers, and all of our listeners out there. We are in a crisis where people could lose their lives. People could become homeless. Children could become more in domestic violence situations. There could be no food on the table. So it's not just that digital divide that is missing, but it's interesting how that if we cannot connect our kids digitally with this world that we're living in, then how do we know? And so that's why it's so important with all of our listeners out there, that if you're in a position to know that you have one student out there that is not connected, I would encourage you, go knock on their door, find out where they live, have your hotspot in your hand, have a tech person with you, and train that family and that child. Because if the child is not connected to us as leaders, they are not connected. And it's important for us to be that courageous leader, to start knocking on doors, to find our kids, to go after our kids, because that's what makes us courageous, and just in and of itself. So Erin, just to kind of back around, I asked that question of you first. Did you want to add anything on? Because I know you had talked about, you and I have talked about this subject in great length as white women leaders. So did you want to add on to that of what Lolly was talking about?
I think the thing that I have been thinking about as I was listening to Lolly is the idea of, how do you create the space for our students to have those conversations and make meaning of our world, especially when we're in a digital space. And so I think we have to, our team is already looking at the pre-election, like how, no matter what happens, someone's not going to be happy. So how do we begin to have those conversations now, creating that space now so that we're not in crisis again? I mean, we are, but I mean, it just feels like there's layers upon layers. We talked about, George Floyd, and then we had fires, and then in, Florida had hurricanes, and it's just piled on. And how do we prepare our students to begin to have those conversations and understand the complexity, but with honesty and openness? And so really, how do we model that?
Right.
We have to model it as leaders, so that then we can turn that practice over to our teachers and they create that space for us. So.
Right. I saw a t-shirt the other day, and it was, it said 2020, and then it had the 5 stars, and only half of the star was colored in. So 2020 has been a challenge for all of us. Before we get into, we have a couple questions from our audience, and but Christina, I'm going to just kind of put you on the spot to add in on that conversation about what Green Dot is doing with your 11,000 students for the Black Lives Matter movement. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Our families and students were deeply impacted by the civil unrest, the calls for racial justice, because the routine of injustice impacts their lives on a regular basis. And that's just real. They've been the most impacted by the pandemic, and now the most impacted by what we've all seen play out on our TV screens. And so in the midst of all of this, we quickly, same as what Erin talked about, we quickly provided spaces for students. We have an advisory period, even now in distance learning for every student, which is kind of your home base. And so through advisory, we created spaces for processing and reflection. We did the same for staff members across the network. We also engaged in listening sessions with students and families and team members, just to understand how they were experiencing what was happening and what thoughts they had. And so as a result of those conversations, we actually accelerated some of our initiatives that we had embedded in a 5-year plan focused on African-American student achievement. And actually a year ago had hired a senior director of African-American achievement and equity. So she helped us to push all those initiatives forward. I was conscious of, we've heard it a little bit in the conversation tonight, words are great, action is what we need. And so we really needed to make sure that everyone saw we were taking concrete action. So one of the big things we accelerated was a partnership with an organization called Overcoming Racism. And those trainings are underway now, and helping us to build an anti-racist organization from the top all the way down to the classroom. And they're going to be doing an equity audit that includes an audit, an analysis of our curriculum, our policies, as well as an audit of our talent practices and perceptions from students and staff and families through a survey that went out. And all that's going to lead to them saying, here's what our audit found, here are your next steps. And so by December, we should receive the results of that equity audit, and then begin to plan for what will come. But the hope is that the relationship with Overcoming Racism really helps us to have that space as adults, to make sure that we are doing that inward reflection, as well as looking outward to see what we can do as an organization. And one of the trainings, the facilitator of Overcoming Racism said, it's interesting when we talk about racism, everybody is looking for the shark in the water, right? So we have to realize it's in the water.
Right.
It's around us. It's in everything that we do. And until we really start to have that critical eye and actively try to create change, we're going to find ourselves in the same place over and over and over again.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, so thank you to our panelists. I'm going to get to a couple of questions from our listeners that were pre-submitted for us this evening. A few questions. I'm going to kind of jump back and forth. We have a couple questions from Megan Robinson. She's the National Director of Content and Implementation at Curriculum and Associates, and also Jenny Linenberger as the Educational Specialist Instructor for Practicum Supervisor at Chino Valley, USD, and also LACO. One question that really I think we need to ask ourselves on a regular basis that is the difference between equal and equitable. So Erin, I'm going to throw this question over to you, that how are equal and equitable actions differentiated?
I think that's a great question. And I think a lot of people have that question in mind. I grew up in a household where everything was equal. My brother and I got equal gifts with the equal amount of money. My mother still to this day makes sure that each grandchild has the same amount of time. And so I've had this conversation with her. I've practiced it a little bit. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of images out there in the internet. You see the boxes. I like to look at it as the bicycles. Usually that, you're not going to hand an adult bicycle to my 8-year-old. You're just not going to do that. It wouldn't fit her. She'd have difficulty with it. I know another educator uses shoes and how we need to have shoes that fit us. When I was in the high school that I served, had the highest amount of refugees in the United States coming through our doors between 2008 and 2016 from Iraq and Syria. And our students that came through that were refugees needed something different than our other English learners. And so we really had to do a lot of education with our teachers that we couldn't approach the curriculum the same way. Our students who were coming to our classrooms didn't have the Roman alphabet knowledge. It was different than some of our other students. And they're learning to write circular conversations, not like right to the point, what's your thesis? And so there was a lot of knowledge that we built, and really to understand that we didn't need to give the exact same amount of time. We didn't have to give the exact same curriculum to our students. We really need to look at what our students needed and when. I think I learned this, this really hit home when I had my second child, and my son was up and running at 10 months and was just super fast in his development. And then I had a daughter who didn't crawl. And I remember taking her to the doctor and saying, like, something's wrong with her. And he's like, can she go from point A to point B? And I'm like, yes. He's like, nothing's wrong. She didn't learn how to walk till she was 17 months. And guess what? She's a proficient walker now. And so she just needed something different. She needed me to carry her. She needed a lot more stroller time. And so I think when we look at this right now, our campuses need to think about who needs to come to campus the most right now. It doesn't have to be about every student coming to campus. We need to think about our vulnerable population from March looks different than our vulnerable population today.
Right.
And so we need to continually assess that and see how we can meet the needs of our students and when do they need it.
Right, yeah. And that's a very good response. This next question from Jenny is that, and I know none of our panelists have ever had a barrier that we've overcome, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But it says, as a female leader, what barriers to success have you encountered and how have you overcome them? We've all had those barriers. And Christine, what barriers have you had and have you had to overcome?
Yeah, you stole the words right out of my mouth. Zero barriers.
Of course. Okay, next question.
Next, moving on.
Moving on.
Honestly, I've been incredibly fortunate in my career to have many mentors who have believed in me before I truly believed in myself. And so I've had been afforded many opportunities as a result of that. I will say I've never been more aware of the fact that I am a woman in my entire career as a teacher, as a principal. as I have been in the last 7 years in my current role as CEO. I remember that first year realizing like, whoa, something is different here that I've never experienced before. And somehow once I was in charge of something big, it was almost hard for people to believe that I was actually in charge. You know, whether it was sitting in meetings with a male counterpart who would not make eye contact with me, would talk directly to my male colleague until he realized that I was the one in charge of the organization. Or I actually remember very distinctly going to look at a facility, a potential facility for one of our school sites. And after 3 different times of telling him I was the decision maker, he finally let me go on the tour. The real estate manager, he said, we're not going to go until the decision maker is here. I don't know how many times I need to tell you, I signed the check, I'm in charge, I'm the one purchasing this facility, let's go on the tour. And I'm sure we all have stories like that, but I will say 7 years later, I'm not gonna say it doesn't bother me anymore, but it bothers me much less. I do get in my head at times, but I've grown thick skin, as you have to in leadership. And I'm confident in my skin, and I almost take it as a challenge. And you know, kind of lean into my inner Beyonce, cue the music and the fan, and I have arrived. So you know, I think I think over time you do grow that thick skin, and you really lean into your confidence and your courage.
Yeah, and I think if I would be interesting to have our listeners just even throw up 2 or 3 words of a barrier that they have overcome, and it would be very interesting because I think we have all overcome those barriers. Lolly, this is an interesting question because you've talked about your student population at Buckley, but this really gets down to some specific regarding reaching your student population. So from Jenny Lindenberger, in these uncertain times during the pandemic, distance learning coupled with civil unrest, how are you leading in your organization and successfully reaching your student population, focusing on your students?
I first want to go back to I like your inner Beyonce. Like, I don't have that one, but I do want to say that's an interesting, I might have to do that image. We all have our own. I have another one. I can't think of it, but I just want to reflect on one other thing. It is the confidence that you have in yourself. It's also building a team of supporters. I've been really fortunate to have a group of women around me who always tell me when I'm leading well and when I'm not. And if you listen to those voices and you understand that they're helping you grow, you will succeed. And so I just want to offer the idea of surrounding yourself by people and building teams is really important. I also want to say, before I get to your question, which now I've forgotten, is there's another, of course, but there's another thing too, is I forget sometimes that I'm a role model for women when I walk. And I don't necessarily recognize that. And I wish I did more, but I would encourage everybody to know, just being who you are, as you were talking about having to tell, you know, the gentleman that you're the decision maker, you are the decision maker, and how you move and what that looks like for both women and men is highly important at this level. So with that, you wanted to ask me about remote.
Jenny, well, yes. Jenny
Yeah.
has talked to us about just the leading your organization successfully. Just focus, and this is our last question. We have about probably about 4 more minutes. So
Okay.
just kind of closing it up and talking to us, Lolly, just about your organization successfully reaching your student population.
Yeah, well, I am fortunate again. Our population is smaller than what I believe most of you are dealing with. And I would say, someone else said this earlier, that communicate often and always, and having really clear about what we're doing, lots of surveys, lots of feedback. Sometimes I wish I had more time to, with this COVID, you know, just talk to the teachers, you know, like in the lounge and have that feedback. And so for us, I think that's been my hardest struggle, is how do you continue to get all of that and everyone on the same page? I think running more meetings has been really helpful for us on that vein. In terms of our students, we really worked hard this summer because, again, I think you mentioned March 12th. For me, our shutdown was March 13th. And we were sort of like figuring out, and we're kind of get to spring break, and then we're going to kind of get to summer. So I feel like it was like patchwork. And then in the summer, we said, this has to be different. And so for us, it's been about technology, professional development, ensuring that kids, and again, I'm at a K through 12, so I'm dealing with all of those different age learners, what that looks like, how can we support the students and the parents. I've got great student mentor volunteers who have now doing tutoring. So I'm just trying to work it at all different ends, but we're thriving.
Thank you, Lolly. So we are out of time. To our listeners, a huge thank you to Christine and Erin and Lolly, and to Linda Rose and the UCLA Women's Leadership Academy, and also the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies and the Women's School Leadership Academy. I just want to thank all of our listeners for your time. I am hopeful that you took away some kernel of thought for this. I think you're going to hold on to it for a couple minutes, but I know that the debate is starting in a couple minutes as well. So you may want to write down that thought and then return to it after the debate. But with that said, I just want to thank everybody and have a good evening, and thank you very much.